Welcome aboard the Ear to There podcast, the podcast that'll help you vacation like a pro in any Disney destination. For those of you standing, please sit down and hold on throughout our journey and get ready to learn how to have the time of your life. And now, here's your host, Phil Gramlich.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Ear to There podcast. I'm your host, Phil Gramlich. I'm also the owner and operator of Ear to There Travel, which is a Disney specialized travel agency. It's my job to help you have the best possible Disney vacation by taking away the stress and anxiety of planning a trip so you can focus on the fun things like your family and enjoying the magic. You can find the podcast, my blog, or request a free quote over at eartotheretravel.com. Now grab a drink, grab a snack, and as a famous mouse once said, on with the show. When Walt Disney opened Disneyland in July of 1955, he wanted the park to be a place where children and adults could go to have fun together. I'm not quite sure he knew just how much fun one particular family was about to have in Disneyland over the next 6 decades. This week, I'm very excited to welcome to the podcast a gentleman who grew up in and around Disneyland in the earliest days of the park. From working in a Disneyland restaurant owned by his father to being a guinea pig for the newest Disneyland attractions, this man's done it all. Rob Defore, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here with you and your audience. Yeah,
so I just want to kind of get into it right away and not really beat around the bush. Now, your dad, Don Defore, was pretty well known in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, right, for being an actor on Ozzie and Harriet and Hazel and a lot of other movies, right, in the 50s and 60s.
I would add the 40s as well, sure. Which is when he did a lot of the feature films and co-starred with many of the greats. He was in Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin's very first movie. In fact, he got billing above them.
Wow.
He was in Charlton Heston's first movie and got billing above him. One of the favorite films in the 40s, it happened on Fifth Avenue. Many people that watch the Turner Classics channel have probably seen it because it's played around Christmas time, just like it happened, Miracle on 34th Street. It's one of my favorite films that he did. But he starred with many of the greats. In fact, one with Ronald Reagan. And as time went on, he moved his career more into writing and politics. So that's why, as you got into the 70s and early 80s, most of his acting was in guest roles on Love Boat or Murder, She Wrote or St. Elsewhere and those kind of TV shows.
Yeah, I read a little bit on your website about. I read a lot about your dad before we did this podcast, but I read a little bit about how he became friends, or he was friends with Ronald Reagan, well into his political career and as president and everything else. It's fascinating to read and to see all the letters from the Reagans that you have on your site. It's very cool.
Well, and it's funny that it really affected my latter half of my career, or most of my career, going back to the early 80s when Ronald Reagan was president. My dad had been named to a presidential advisory board at that time for the Peace Corps, and I was... I had a number of careers living in Los Angeles in film and television, and but was between jobs. And he said, "Hey, there's a spot open running the West Coast office in West LA in Westwood, and they're looking for somebody that is familiar with the media. And it's not a political appointment, but you'd have to compete for it." And anyway, make a long story short, I thought, well, that'd be interesting. So I applied for it, competed against a number of other people, got the job, and for several years ran that office, brought its productivity way up from where it was and got all sorts of awards. Anyway, and many people around me were saying, why are you in a career civil servant government position when your dad is best friends with Ronald Reagan? I said, I never wanted to use my dad in my career, including when I was the associate director of the Steve Allen show in the early 70s. I got there by climbing up through about 8 different positions. Had nothing to do with my dad. Anyway, as time went on, I learned that only a fool does not use connections in the political world. That's what it's all about. And so I finally took up my dad's continuing offer to send my resume directly to the president, and the rest is history from there. I had 3 different political appointments in the Reagan administration, finally ending up as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs for the Department of Transportation.
Wow, that's a really cool career that you had. And talk about, you started out in L.A. with your dad and on the show business side of it. And now you're still in D.C., right? You still are in that area.
Well, I formed a public affairs firm in 1995 with 2 other partners based on the experience that I had at the Department of Transportation with car companies and other transportation. And within 3 years, we built the largest automotive public relations practice in the country. We sold the majority interest to an international PR firm. I still retain stock in the company, but I'm not an employee anymore. So I'm 99% retired outside of D.C. in a little place called Haymarket, and we love it out here. It's nice and quiet, and occasionally I'll do some things for a client or two, but it's mostly retirement and my brother and I going around the country doing these presentations about growing up in Disneyland, which we love.
Yeah, that's what I wanted, the main thing that I wanted to talk to you about. And before I was saying before we started recording that I'd met you briefly out at the D23 Expo in Anaheim last year. But before I had seen a little bit about who you were and who you are and who your dad was, I had honestly never heard of the Silver Banjo BBQ, and I consider myself kind of a Disney nerd and a Disney junkie. So can we talk a little bit about like what it was like, for you growing up, and you were living out in California with your dad, who was very famous at the time, and how did it come about? How did the Silver Banjo the Rob Defore Silver Banjo, come out of into Disneyland and was it 57? I believe it was.
It opened in 57, and it started with, many people don't know, that my father was president of the Television Academy in 1954 and 1955. And my father, along with Ed Sullivan, were the first to ever sell the live, nationally, coast-to-coast telecast of the Emmy Awards to NBC. Had never been done before. And this is before, being able to beam signals on satellite. And so it was an amazing technological feat just by itself to be able to switch, because in those days there was a New York chapter run by Ed Sullivan and the West Coast chapter run by my dad, and so you'd have 2 rooms full of stars sitting. In those days they were sitting at dining tables, and they got food right, in addition to getting to watch the awards. And shortly thereafter, my dad got a congratulatory call directly from Walt Disney, and we figured out, later that, Walt was very pleased that this awards was now going to be seen by everybody in the country every year, because he had just started his own TV show and was hoping to get much more exposure to Disney And so he invited my dad out to the Burbank Disney Studios, and my dad said, would love to do it. Can I bring the Academy's PR guy, Bud Colson, along with me? I think he'd enjoy it too. And Walt said, sure. So, make a long story short, my dad and Bud Colson are out there, and Walt's giving him a personal tour, and he brings him in one of the studios that's highly guarded. And there's all sorts of wild stuff there, not for movies, but as Walt explained, he says, these are some of the props and things that are going to be going into my latest creation, Disneyland. Wow. And so fast forward to the opening day of Disneyland, after my dad had become friends with Walt. Walt invited our whole family to be in the opening day parade, and when we do this presentation, I've actually got the video, the kinescope film of that parade showing the Defore family riding up Main Street in the Autopia cars, and we got some great black and white stills of that moment too. And it wasn't until recently. One of my friends emailed me. He says, I'm looking at this photo. He says, do you realize who is driving your dad's Autopia car? And I said, no, I have no idea. He said, that's a very young Bob Gurr. Wow. And, of course, you and your audience, I'm sure, know who Bob Gurr was. And he developed all of the vehicles, that are on many of the rides. So then it was fast forward to about a year later, Frito-Lay, that had the space where my dad's restaurant eventually went in Frontierland, right next to Aunt Jemima's. They wanted to move because the space was too small. They eventually moved more towards the entrance of Frontierland. And they needed to fill it with something. And by that time, Walt had hired Bud Colson, that's why I mentioned his name, to be in charge of managing all of the lessees within the park. And so Bud called my dad and said, hey, I remember you telling me stories about you knowing how to cook, and you cooked your way through college, yada, yada, yada. How would you like to open up a restaurant in Disneyland? Wow. And the rest is history. My dad went for it right away, had his brother Vern manage it. They both had to take a restaurant management course at UCLA, and in 1957, Don Defore's Silver Banjo opened.
Wow, so that's a cool story, because it's like, did your dad have a lot of professional? He didn't have any professional experience as far as running a restaurant went, right?
No, I'm not even sure how much of cooking he actually did. Right. I'm sure he did in college, but nowhere near what a professional chef would do. And this really boils down to the relationship with Walt, the relationship with Bud Colson. And as a matter of fact, we've gotten to know Becky Klein, the head of archives, very well, and I've met with her numerous times. And I remember one of the first times when we went to archives in Burbank, her commenting on some memos that they had and saying, man, your dad must have been pretty close to Walt, because there's no other living human being that ever was allowed to display their name in the park. Now, my brother always chimes in. He says, well, what about Davy Crockett? And I said, well, that's why I qualified it. It's a living human being. And as you know, there are others like Art Linkletter that did own, he owned the Kodak concession, but he was not allowed to display his name. So the fact that they approved the signage and the name with my dad's name on it is, as Becky said, is a testament to the relationship my dad had with Walt. Yeah,
it's so neat to look at all the pictures of that area back then and see the signs for the restaurant and everything. And yeah, it is very unique to see a name up there. It's surprising. You're full of even Walt Disney World. I just got back from Walt Disney World 2 days ago with my family, and sure, there's a lot of pretend fictional names up there on every your Pecos Bills and your Cosmic Rays, but very cool to have a real person's name, especially in Disneyland back then. That must be the coolest thing.
There is one exception to that, which you're probably familiar with, and those are the commemoratives on some of the windows, right, mostly on Main Street. Actually, there is one for Davy Crockett as you first enter Frontierland on the left. And we've been working for many years with Becky to try and get Disney to do one for my dad, but so far unsuccessful.
He needs a window. That would be the ultimate in an honor for your dad. That would be very cool. I did see. Now I don't want to take the interview completely off the rails, but I did see something that somehow a plaque got placed into the old spot where the restaurant used to be. I didn't know if there was a story behind that on how it got there.
Well, there's a very funny story about not only a plaque. There was plaques plural.
Okay.
And when my brother and I do this presentation, that's kind of the end of the presentation. It's a punchline. I don't mind sharing it here with your audience. And basically what it was, it's a dream that my brother and I had for years, or kind of a kidding back and forth that, they should put a plaque up, to commemorate that restaurant, because it is such an unusual, little-known part of the park.
Sure.
And by the way, the facade for the restaurant is still there. It's exactly the same. It's unchanged. It's just that it's being used as a storage area for the restaurant right next door. But if you look at the outside, it's exactly the same. So we were thinking, you put a plaque up there. Well, fast forward to the 1996 or 7 Disneyana convention. Back then, I think it was called the National Fantasy Fan Club, and I can see why they changed the name. Yeah. Anyway, we that was the very first time that I went to any of these conventions. I had spent years on eBay buying up any of the movie posters or any movie or TV memorabilia of my dad's. I just got loads of it. And then I switched I thought, well, I wonder if there's anything on the Silver Banjo. And so I went to one of these conventions, and it was amazing. I introduced myself to the first guy at the first booth, and this was the show where everybody's selling various memorabilia. Sure. And he freaked out. And he grabbed my arm. He says, "I can't believe that you're Don Defore's son." And he took me from booth to booth, saying, "You're not going to believe who's here." And I felt like William Shatner at a Star Trek convention. I thought, this is really weird. I right. would have never thought that the Silver Banjo would be, that big of a thing, but it turned out it is, because it wasn't there that long. There's not a lot of memorabilia out there. I probably have the largest collection of the various photos, and I still have 2 of the signs that have been restored. But even that, it's not a lot. I don't know why we didn't take a lot of exterior shots. But anyway, so I go around, and then I meet a train consultant who's selling all sorts of train stuff. And he says, "Hey, were you at the auction last night?" I said, "No, I just came in today." I said, "Why?" He says, "Well, because one of the official postcards for the Silver Banjo was auctioned off last night." And I thought, "Really? How much did it go for?" And he says, "Oh, it went for like $500. And I'm thinking in my mind, "Oh my gosh, there's a whole stack of them in my dad's safe up at the house." So as soon as I left, I went to the safe. My dad had passed away by then, of course. And sure enough, I looked at that and I said, "Well, you know what? I've got a brother and 3 sisters, but I'm the one that found out where the gold is." So I took that stack, and to this day I still have a number of them. In fact, I'm going to be selling 2 of them. And let me just say, about 10 years later, I was reminiscing this story in my mind. And I thought, I wonder if they really are worth that. And I put it on eBay, buy it now, $500, and it sold in 2 hours.
Oh man!
So it's part of my retirement plan. But getting back to what happened after that was I had developed really an obsession to find as much on the Silver Banjo as I could. And that's when I called my brother and I said, "You know what? We're going to put up a plaque, whether Disney wants us to do it or not."
Right. And
so I researched the appropriate Frontierland font that they would probably use. I'm a wordsmith by trade, so I kind of figured out what the short little slogan would be. If Disneyland were to put up a commemorative plaque up there, and I had it made. I went to a professional company, and they made a brass plaque, and we wound up putting it up there. And the way that happened was this was the next Disneyana convention. We noticed that somebody was doing a book signing. We go over, and it's David Mumford and Bob Gordon signing the book that they had just come out with called Disneyland: The Nickel Tour. And David, when we introduced ourselves, he says, "Oh my God, I loved interviewing your dad." And he turns to the right page, and there's actually 2 pages of an interview with my dad and all about the Silver Banjo BBQ. And he says, "Oh, I'm so happy to meet you. That was one of the favorite interviews that I did. Your dad was so nice." Anyway, so and then I didn't know who David was, but during the conversation, found out that he, at that time, I believe, was vice president of Imagineering, or very high up Imagineering, currently a Disney employee. So while we're standing there, keep in mind, this was going to be the day that we were going to surreptitiously put up a plaque on the facade. And so I'm carrying a bag with this brass plaque. I'm with my brother, and I'm with my 80-year-old mother, who's all ready, willing, and able to do this dirty trick thing too. But I'm talking with David Mumford, and he's so enthusiastic about the history of the park. I decided, you know what? Even though we all decided that we weren't going to tell anybody about this, I pulled David aside. I said, "Look, I'm going to tell you something, but you've got to promise to take off your Disney employee hat and just enjoy it." And he says, "Sure, what are you talking about?" And I said, "Let me show you what I have in this bag." And I said, "When we leave here, we're walking across the street, and we're going to go and put this up on the facade where the Silver Banjo used to be." And he looked and read the plaque. He totally cracked up, and he said, "That is fantastic." He says, "I won't tell anybody." He says, "Good for you guys." He says that Disney should do that themselves, but if they're not, I'm glad somebody is. So fast forward to we're at the park. It's at night. I've got double stick-em tape on this plaque. My brother and my mom are kind of looking out because there's all sorts of employees hanging around, the bus boys sweeping the floor and managers and security. And so they kind of, my brothers, finally said, "Go, do it," right when the coast was clear. And I stick this thing on. And so we got all sorts of photos with the three of us standing in front of the two French doors that were part of the entrance to the restaurant. And so we actually got one of the guys, the floor sweepers, to take the picture of us, and I'm sure he had no idea what he was taking a picture of. And so we're all through. We're ready to go. I mean, and that's all we did in the park. I mean, just that alone, people probably can't imagine that you'd pay to get into Disneyland. Don't go on any of the rides. Right. You just go do one thing and then you leave. And then, and as I'm leaving, I'm thinking, nowadays I'm sure the park has cameras and their security is certainly a lot greater than it was when we were kids. And I'm thinking, God, I just hope, they don't get caught. And all of a sudden, I hear behind me, hold it, stop, wait. And some guy pulls my shoulder, and I'm thinking, oh God, I've just got busted. And it's David Mumford with about 8 of his friends. And he says, "Ron, I couldn't keep it to myself. We had to come over and see this." So the final photo that I show in the presentation is David and Carol Mumford and a whole bunch of his friends, my mom, my brother, and I standing in front of the plaque. And it was great. And if I can, there's actually an extra part of that story that's funny. The train consultant that I came to know was at the park, at least once a week. He'd call me like every month or so, and he said, "Ron, I just walked by the plaque. It's still there. It's still there." And for months, he'd call by, and one time in the summer, he called laughing his head off. And I said, "What's so funny?" And he said, "Well, you know how meticulous Disney Corporation is on maintaining the park, and everything's painted like every 6 months, and everything has to look exactly the same for every time somebody comes in the park." He says the maintenance manual is about 6 feet thick. He said there's now a page in the Disneyland maintenance manual on how to maintain the Rob Defore Silver Banjo BBQ plaque.
Wow.
So we got a kick out of that. Unfortunately, a few months later, he called and he said, "Ron, the plaque is no longer there." So we figure that there's a plaque sitting on some Disney executive's desk, so he can constantly wonder how and where did this thing ever get there.
That's so funny. I have a friend of mine actually that works out there now. He's an operations manager in California Adventure. And I had him go looking for it, actually, because I knew I was going to talk to you, and he so far has come up empty. But he said he thinks he knows there's still kind of like a little spot on the wall where it looks like it may have been, which I thought was really cool. There's still like a...
Well, let me leave your audience with a little teaser, and I'm not going to tell the full story. If they want to hear this whole presentation, we are once again presenting at the what they call the Disney Mania convention in Anaheim. I think it's the 13th through the 16th. We're presenting on Friday the 15th. So would love to have any of your audience that are interested to come and hear it. But let me just give you the teaser. This wasn't the only plaque. And what you just described on the wall remnants of another plaque is probably not this original plaque.
Oh, okay.
There was another plaque put up, and I'll leave it at that. And that's a funny story too. So stay tuned.
All right, well, Ron, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And if anybody wants to go see it, it's growing up in Disneyland, from the opening day parade to Frontierland's Don Defore Silver Banjo BBQ at the, as Ron was saying, the Wyndham Anaheim Garden Grove Hotel, Friday, July 15th at 10:30 a.m. So make sure you go see it. Ron, thank you so much for giving me a little bit of your time today. I really appreciate it. It was really fun to talk to you.
Thank you, Phil.
That'll wrap up this week's episode of the Ear to There podcast. Thanks again to my guest, Ron Defore. I always love talking about the early days of Disneyland. That was a lot of fun to talk about that with him. So thanks again, Ron. All I ask is that if you did enjoy the podcast, please go on social media. Feel free to share this and any other episode that I've done, or heck, share all of the episodes that I've done so far. Just remember, there will be a new episode of the Ear to There podcast every Monday morning for you to download. I really look forward to bringing you the next episode. Thanks. Have a great week. Bye-bye.